I welcome everybody to the second in our two sessions on climate and conversations and faith. I'm Lori Benson. I'm chair of the First-Plymouth Climate Action Team, and we're delighted to have you all with us this evening. This evening, we're honored to have Dr. Don Wilhite discussing climate change science, Code Red for Humanity. Dr. Wilhite is a professor and director emeritus of Applied Climate Science, School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He served as director of the School of Natural Resources from 2007 to 2012. Don founded the National Drought Mitigation Center at UNL in 1995 and served as its director until 2007. And I'll just detour for a second and mention that if you've seen the climate, or if you've seen the drought map in the newspaper, or maybe seen it online in a story about drought, you have almost certainly seen a map from Don's National Drought Mitigation Center. Don was elected a fellow of the American Meteorological Society in 2013. His research and outreach activities have focused on issues of drought monitoring, planning, mitigation, and policy, the use of climate information in decision-making, and climate change. He has collaborated with and led many efforts by U.S. states, the federal agencies, federal foreign governments, and United Nations agencies on efforts to improve drought management following a risk-based management approach that Don developed. And that approach has become the international standard for drought planning. Don is the editor or co-editor of numerous books and is also the author or co-author of two reports on the implications of climate change for Nebraska, published in 2014 and 2016. And I know the 2014 report is on the Climate Action Team's website. So with that, Don, the floor is yours, and I will mention that we will hold questions till the end. If you've got questions, please put them in the chat and we will monitor those and hope that there's time for a few at the end of Don's presentation. So go ahead, Don.
Okay, thanks very much, Lori. Let me get this thing going here. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So thanks very much for the introduction, and nice to see a lot of faces that I recognized before we went to the slides. So it's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation to give this talk as sort of a follow-on to what we did last fall. Here, spending a little less time on the science and talking about a lot of other issues associated with climate change, particularly the implications of climate change and so on. So if you look at the title slide, Climate Change, Code Red for Humanity, I actually borrowed the Code Red for Humanity subtitle from a number of press releases that came out a couple of months ago in association with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that was recently released, in which the Secretary General of the United Nations used that phrase, Code Red for Humanity, because of the urgency in trying to deal with this issue as a society going forward. It's important that we do something about it. And if you've been keeping up with the news since October 31st, you're probably seeing a lot of articles about the climate change conference that's going on in Glasgow, UK at the moment. President Biden has been there this week, and as well as the leaders from over 190 countries of the world trying to talk about solutions and what we can do in the face of this Code Red for Humanity. So this conference is called COP26. Some of you have heard that terminology before. You don't understand what COP stands for. It actually stands for Conference of the Parties. And so the fact that this is the 26th one means that we've been trying to do something with this issue of climate change from a global perspective for many years. And it's really been since 2015 with the Paris Climate Treaty and so on, and this one that's going on now, that I think we've been trying to take more aggressive steps in dealing with this problem. One of the things you've also seen in the news over the last few years is the global youth movement. A lot of this is being led by youth in all countries, but certainly Greta Thunberg from Sweden has been one of the primary motivators for this. And I ran across this quote recently from Nelson Mandela, in which he said, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way it treats its youth and children." So right now, I don't think we're treating our children very well. When you think about the world that we're leaving to them, those of us that are middle age or older, as they sort of move into a position of decision maker, positions of power, and so on. So this is something we really need to be concerned about. I know I'm concerned for my children and my grandchildren, and I'm sure you are as well. We need to import that level of urgency to our politicians as well, so they get on board with making substantial changes in how we're addressing this issue. I wanted to follow on a bit with the discussion that Catherine Hayhoe did last week by indicating a few of what I consider to be some of the main talking points or takeaways from her presentation. And I'm going to build on some of those tonight. First of all, a changing climate impacts all living things, including humans. And so this really defines why it matters to us. And we'll elaborate on that a little bit more as we go forward. Second point is the most vulnerable will suffer the most. And so when we talk about the most vulnerable, we're talking not just about those people in developing countries, but those people that really don't have the resources to respond. And so that not only includes individuals living in developing countries, but also, a lot of marginalized populations that exist in developed countries as well. Those people are very much at risk, but have very little in the way of resources to deal with this problem. She also talked about, and one of the major focuses of her presentation was that we must talk about climate change with family, friends, and others. The reason I've highlighted that in red is while it's important that we talk about climate change and make that as part of our discussion, it's also important to understand that in order to talk about climate change, we need to know something about it so that we have information available to help people understand this issue, because most people do not understand it. It's a very complex scientific issue. And so understanding why it's important that we do something about this now, the urgency of that, and the fact that it affects all living things, we need to be able to expand upon that and discuss with people some of the science behind climate change, so it's just not routinely dismissed. She also talked about the lack of action on climate change is a failure of love, and talked about stewardship of the earth. This is important as well as that climate change is a threat multiplier. And I'm going to expand on that. And then finally, that action leads to hope. And so oftentimes we talk about hope leading to action, but in fact, it's the other way around. We take action, and action leads to hope that we're going to be able to deal with this problem in the near future and for future generations. So getting back to this issue of climate change being a threat multiplier, what I've listed in these various circles around this graph, this illustration, these are our major issues that you hear talked about in the media constantly. Certainly, if you follow any of the discussions in the United Nations, you see this as well. And these are all represented in what are called the Sustainable Development Goals that the United States or the United Nations has brought forth, and more than 195 nations have actually signed on to trying to address these sustainable development goals by the year 2030. And the reason I put these up there is climate change is also one of those sustainable development goals. And if you think about how we're going to be able to address issues like biodiversity, national security, human health, social justice, environmental justice, migration, all of these issues are so keenly tied to climate change. If we don't address climate change, it will be literally impossible to achieve increased biodiversity, protection for biodiversity, national security, and all of the things shown on this particular graph. Lori just mentioned a few minutes ago these two reports, and so she indicated that the first one, done in 2014, was on the First-Plymouth website, I guess, for the Climate Action Team. But both of these reports are available at the URL that you see at the bottom. So these are available in PDF formats. And so the first one really was a product of the University of Nebraska. I was part of the author team that pulled this report together in 2014. Hopefully many of you maybe have a copy of this report, a hard copy. They're hard to come by these days, but a digital copy is available. And then we followed that 2014 report where I organized with
go to First-Plymouth. Yeah, don't go to Almy, go to firstplymouth.org.
with the assistance of Kim Morrow, we organized 8 sector-based roundtables to bring stakeholders from throughout Nebraska together. And we had over 350 stakeholders involved in this series of 8 sector-based roundtables, talking about everything from human health to agriculture, to water supply, to energy, to faith community, and so on, where we tried to look at coming up with appropriate adaptation and mitigation strategies to address the issue of climate change for the state of Nebraska. So I would encourage you to go take a look at these reports. Even though the 2014 report was done 7 years ago, the science is still valid. The projections are also valid, and we'll talk about those now. So in terms of projections, what we found in our 2014 report, and this really hasn't changed if you look at other reports like the National Climate Assessment or the work that's coming out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If we look at temperature trends going into the future, or looking at by the last quarter of this century, an increase in temperature of between 4 and 5 degrees following a low emissions scenario, or 8 to 9 degrees of warming following a more higher emissions scenario. We'll come back to that a little bit more as we go along. So the reason for this range is not because the models are not very good. Models actually do a very good job. The reason for this range is because of the uncertainties in future emissions. And those future emissions are based upon our behaviors and what we're going to do from a policy and management perspective to actually address climate change going forward. We're also talking about an increase in, not just an increase in high temperatures, but these high temperature stress days. And you're hearing more and more about those, particularly in terms of the heat index. And so once again, depending upon whether we look at a low emission scenario or a higher emission scenario, we're talking about a substantial increase in these high temperature stress days, which are not only harmful to human health, but to ecosystem health and to animals, all animals on this planet, and so on. Also an increase in extreme events affecting Nebraska and of course other areas of the world. We'll come back to that later. A continued increase in the frost-free season. We've already had an increase in our frost-free season in Nebraska. It varies between, say, 5 days and 10 days, depending on which portion of the state you're in. But projections for adding an additional 2 weeks by the end of the century. And that may sound like good news, but this presents other kinds of problems as well, which we don't have time to really go into now. And also precipitation patterns, distribution, the intensity of precipitation events, and so on. And a lot of this is associated with increasing temperatures means there's more evaporation, therefore more water vapor in the atmosphere. And so this leads to all kinds of issues with regards to precipitation patterns, distribution, seasonal distribution, and so on. But in general, the models are projecting that the Central Great Plains area of the United States is actually going to go through a gradual drying over the period towards the end of as we move towards the end of the century. So we can ask the question then, what's at risk for Nebraska? And so this gets back to that question that Catherine was asking last week. You know, what do you care about? And I think all of the things that I've listed in this slide, these are all things that I think all of us care about: agriculture, ecosystems, public health, and so on. So we need to be able to talk to people about that and how it's going to affect them in the future and how that's already affecting them today. So there are some foundational thoughts that I wanted to throw out. Some of these were touched on maybe briefly by Catherine last week. First of all, this difference between weather and climate. It's amazing how many people get so confused about these two terms. Weather, we're just talking about the condition of the atmosphere at a particular place and time. So it's really focused on, you know, the weather, what the weather is today or tomorrow or in the near term. Whereas with climate, we're really talking about the composite of weather, averages. We're talking about trends going forward and trends up to this point in time with regards to temperature, precipitation, extreme events, and so on. And the key point here is that climate, almost everything that we do, what crops we grow, where we grow them, when we plant, the kinds of architecture that we use to build our buildings and so forth, our heating and ventilation systems, our storm sewers, our reservoirs, our levee system, all of these things are based upon what we refer to as the historical climate. So this is the climate, the average climate over the last 30, 50, 60 years. The problem is with climate change is we're moving to a new normal. And as yet, we don't know what that new normal is going to be because it's a moving target. But if anything that we're planning for the future, we can no longer base that upon the historical climate. We have to take into account how the climate is changing going forward. Two other critical points here is when people, particularly deniers of climate change, or those people who don't feel that we should do anything about this, oftentimes they'll refer to the fact, well, it's going to cost a lot to take action on climate change. Well, yes, there are costs associated with taking action on climate change, but you have to weigh these against the cost of inaction. If we don't do anything, then the cost to humanity is going to be much, much greater. So we need to do something, and we need to be talking about the benefits of action rather than the fact that it's going to cost too much to deal with this problem. So here's a cartoon that talks about the proverbial elephant in the room. And so I think a lot of us, when we're trying to strike up a conversation with someone, or if we're in an NRD meeting, or we're attending some sort of an event in which people are talking about planning, whether it's the city council meeting or the state legislature, or wherever it is, the elephant in the room is the issue of climate change. And whether that's being addressed in association with whatever discussions going on about planning for your community, or with your particular neighborhood, or at the state level, or for agriculture or water resource planning, elephant is in the room, and we have to be talking about climate change and how that's affecting us today and how it's going to affect us going forward. So I'm going to give you one example here of the elephant in the room. In 2018 and 2019, the former president of the University of Nebraska, Hank Bounds, started a conversation with Governor Ricketts in which he wanted to talk about developing a blueprint for Nebraska. This was something that was done in the state that he lived in prior to coming to Nebraska. And so they were talking about the business community and how we can bring the business community together and plan for the future in terms of how do we retain, brain power within the state instead of so many youth leaving, how we are going to attract new businesses, how we're going to attract new jobs. And so they were talking about growing the good life. And they produced a report in which nowhere in that report does it talk about climate change. And this report was looking at a time horizon out to 2030. And ignoring the issue of climate change is just criminal. And so how they can produce a report that talks about the future of Nebraska and growing the good life and not addressing climate change and what that's going to mean to our economy, to our environment, to our social fabric within the state, to me is just ludicrous. So here's a contrasting example. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce came out earlier this year with a statement on effective climate policy. And I've colored in red some of the key points in these various bullets that they put it as part of their climate policy. And so they were talking about accelerating, greenhouse gas emissions, leveraging the power of business, maintaining U.S. leadership in climate science, technology, energy efficiency, climate resilient infrastructure, and so on, international cooperation. This was, I thought, a very progressive sort of look at what we need to be doing from a business perspective in the United States in terms of climate policy, whereas the blueprint for Nebraska completely ignored climate change. The final comment in their discussion of effective climate policy, their final point was that inaction is not an option. And I think this should resonate with everybody. We need to be taking action on this issue, and we need to be doing it now, and we need to be doing it very aggressively. So how do we know that the climate is changing and what the causes are? Well, these three boxes sort of define that, and I'm going to talk about each one of those just briefly. Physics and theory, first of all. I think most of you are familiar with the terminology associated with the greenhouse effect. And really, in order to have a stable global temperature, which we have had for the last, until recently, for the last several hundred years, is energy coming in from the sun needs to equal energy going out. So this gives us what's called a steady state or a stable climate. The reality is, because of the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the greenhouse gases are the heat regulators for planet Earth, if we increase the concentration of these in the atmosphere, we're actually upsetting this balance. And it's like, as Catherine referred to last week, like putting a blanket around planet Earth. So we're retaining more and more heat energy because of the increasing concentration of these greenhouse gases. So when we talk about climate and climate change, one of the terms that gets used is the term climate forcing. So I thought maybe I should talk just for a minute about, what is a climate forcing? Well, climate forcing is something that changes the balance between incoming and outgoing energy. So anything that does that is referred to as a climate forcing. So there are natural forcings, And these have been operating for millennia and so on. These natural forces like changes in the Earth's orbit, changes in the amount of energy that we receive from the sun, volcanic eruptions and so on. These are natural forcing. In addition, though, we also have man-made or human-induced forcing. And examples of these are changes in the concentration of greenhouse gases, air pollutions, changes in land use, and so on. And this is what is currently causing our changing climate. It's human-induced changes to the forcings that are affecting climate on planet Earth. And so these greenhouse gas emissions, and the three we hear the most about are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And these have been increasing dramatically since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, around 1750 or so, there were 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're now looking at 417 parts per million. And so we have comparable increases in methane and nitrous oxide. Methane is actually a much more powerful gas, greenhouse gas, than carbon dioxide, but its concentration in the atmosphere is less, and also its shelf life in the atmosphere is remarkably less than carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide. So if we look at the shelf life of these greenhouse gases, methane stays in the atmosphere for around 10 years. Of course, we're adding new methane all of the time. And so even though it's filtering out of the atmosphere, being stored and so on, its shelf life is longer. Whereas carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere now is going to be there for 1,000 or more years. So what this says is that the greenhouse gas increase that we've already seen has already set us in motion to continue this warming. And what we need to do is reduce dramatically the concentration of greenhouse gases or the emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in order to lower the curve. We'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. Also, observations. This is another way that we know that the climate is changing. If we look at the temperature of the ocean, sea surface temperatures, temperature over land, sea level rise, what's happening to the concentration or the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, these are all increasing. These are important indicators of a warming world. Other indicators of a warming world are the things like the melting of glaciers and ice sheets, snowpack, the disappearance of sea ice in the Arctic and in other regions and so on. So all of these are indicators of a warming world, and we are monitoring all of these things on a routine basis by ground stations, ocean-based stations, or by satellites. And so we know all of these changes are occurring. And you've all seen graphs like this that show global mean temperature. And superimposed upon that is carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. So you've got this almost perfect relationship between those two features. And then finally, prediction. So where are we going forward with regards to the climate change? And so how do we predict the future? Well, the way we do that is through the use of models. And so you can ask the questions, well, are these models any good? Well, one of the ways that we know that these models are good, and there are many different models out there, and usually we use a composite of models rather than just one single one in terms of making projections into the future. But one of the ways that we know that these models are working and are doing a reasonably good job is by looking at the past. And so we have here observed global temperature change from 1850 to current in the red line. And if we run the models and we we put in both natural and human forces that may be affecting our climate, we can see that those models do a very good job of overlaying the observed changes in global temperature. One of the nice things about the models is you can tinker with the models. And you can, for example, hold CO2 or carbon dioxide constant in the model. And if you do that, if you hold carbon dioxide constant in the model and you run these models without carbon dioxide increasing, then you can see that the temperature on planet Earth should have been relatively stable. So as we look to the future, we run these models and we project the future, and by using these models, we can look at alternative futures. So going forward, we can project what would happen if we continue to emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at current rates, and this is normally called the business as usual scenario. And this is the kind of warming that would result. Only two of these paths going forward would actually lower the temperature and keep it within this 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is saying that we need to do in order to avoid some of the catastrophic consequences moving forward. So if we look at the implications of climate change, and I put together here sort of a progression. So if we're talking increased atmospheric carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas concentrations, this in turn leads to more heat being retained in the atmosphere, increasing temperatures, increasing evaporation and transpiration, changes in the amount of precipitation, changes in the intensity, the form of precipitation, less snowfall, in other words, and also seasonal distribution. All of this leads to an increased frequency and severity of extreme events and an increase in the economic, social, environmental costs associated with these increasing frequency of extreme events. So in other words, by reducing emissions and lowering the curve so we don't have as much warming as we'd have if we retain or continue to be on this business as usual scenario, we're going to reduce future temperature increases and in turn reduce societal impacts. So when Lori and I were talking about this presentation, there's been a lot of new information, a lot of new things that have come out this past year or so. And so I thought I would mention a couple of things that you've perhaps heard about, read about in the media. One is the fact that we recently moved to a new set of normals. So you can ask the question, what is a new normal? Well, if you listen to 1011 News, for example, on the weather report, they spend a lot of time talking about the new normals for Nebraska or for Lincoln, Nebraska, and so forth. And so the bottom line here is that NOAA computes averages based upon a 30-year time period. So every 10 years, the time period for that 30-year window changes, and they generate a series of new averages for all cities and areas within the United States. And this same thing is done throughout the world. And so if you look at the new normals for the United States, so in other words, instead of these being based upon the temperature averages between 1981 and 2010, the new normal period is 1991 through 2020. And this is the amount of change that has occurred as a result of adding this new 10-year period and subtracting the decade of 1981 through 1990. And so that you can see that warming has been pretty significant in the Western United States as a result of these new normals. And also in the Eastern United States, not as much in the North Central region. So we're kind of on the border here. If you compare the warming for the new normal period of 1991 through 2020 to the normal period of 1901 to 1930, then you can see that the warming that has occurred is much more substantial. And so a relatively small change in averages leads to a major change in extremes. And that's what we're seeing with extremes of high temperature, heat wave, the frequency of heat waves, intense rainfall events, flooding events, and so on moving forward. So extreme events, as we talked about earlier, and Catherine talked about a bit last week, extreme events tend to expose our vulnerabilities and the inequities that we have in societies. So whether we're talking about the effects of extreme events on healthcare, on marginalized population, and when I'm talking about extreme events here, I'm not just talking about those that may be happening because of climate change. Think of these various bullets in terms of what COVID-19 has exposed in terms of our vulnerabilities in our healthcare system, inequities in terms of marginalized populations, institutions, our ability to respond to a pandemic, for example. Another thing we heard about a lot this last summer was this concept of heat domes, these large high pressure systems that are forming, and high pressure systems are associated with air which is descending and it's warming through via compression, and it's causing things like the jet stream to go around these high pressure systems. These high pressure systems are not conducive to rainfall, and so you have these elevated temperatures associated with these high pressure or heat domes that are occurring. And in July of this year, this was an interesting pattern where we had in the Northern Hemisphere 5 separate heat domes that formed during the month of July. And so this created quite a pattern of heat waves and so on around the country, around the world. One of the only other thing I'm going to mention is this issue of attribution science. And I think this is a really important one. One of the things that deniers of climate change will say is, well, but we've had droughts in the past. We've had floods in the past. We've had hurricanes. And that's true. All of these things have occurred in the past. The challenge for the climate science community has been trying to ferret out the changes or in the frequency and intensity of these extreme events under climate change versus when the climate was not changing. And so this field of attribution science has come about in the last few years, in which scientists are trying to determine to what degree was this drought influenced by climate change and added to its severity or added to the frequency of extreme drought events or flood events or hurricanes and so on. So this area of attribution science is something that we're going to be hearing a lot more about as this science moves forward. They've really made a lot of progress in trying to separate out how climate change is influencing these extreme events. So what's not new? Well, what's not new is the fact that these extreme events have been increasing in frequency and in terms of environmental, social, and economic costs for many years. And so here you have a trend going back to 1980 up to current. And you see the average over that period is down here of the number of disaster events that resulted in losses of $1 billion or more. So it's not that they equaled $1 billion, it's $1 billion is the threshold. And so you see 2020 here, you see 2021 where we are here. And so there will likely continue to be more of these as we finish out the year. And you can see these other colored lines are all recent years as well. So the number of these extreme events that are causing very expensive disasters, both from a social, economic, and environmental perspective, has been increasing dramatically. And if we look at this chart prepared by NOAA, I mean, one of the striking things is that since 1980, there have been $285 billion disasters in the US that have resulted in losses of almost $2 trillion. So think of that in terms of the current infrastructure bills that are currently before Congress, and trying to build back better and trying to develop better infrastructure moving forward into the 21st century. And this is true for Nebraska as well. Here we see the number of billion-dollar disaster events from 1980, 2021 in the state of Nebraska. And look at the increase in frequency and the type of events, whether it's droughts, whether it's floods, whether it's heat waves, and so on, that have occurred in our state in more recent years. So challenges and opportunities going forward. We know that global temperatures are rising at an unprecedented rate. The greenhouse gases are the heat regulators of the Earth's atmosphere. And as I mentioned previously, we hit 417 parts per million in 2021, compared to 280 parts per million at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And human activity is the main driver for these changes. And if you look at the data, there's really no other explanation that can explain the types of changes in our climate that we're seeing. And so as these global temperatures rise, we have impacts that are affecting our extreme weather events that are becoming more frequent, more severe, and of longer duration. And if you just look at the drought that's been affecting the Western United States for the last 20 years, you see an example of that sort of thing. And this is occurring everywhere, just not in the United States. So key points moving forward. We have the technology to successfully address climate change. What we're currently lacking is the political will to do so. And so when politicians are dragging their feet on this issue, ignoring this issue, we as Americans need to speak up and challenge them on this issue and the lack of action. So we really need to move from inaction to action to hope, and this has to happen on a global scale. Remind you once again of this key point about the cost of inaction versus the benefits of action. Ken Haar is on the Zoom call tonight, and I think Ken Winston's probably here as well. The three of us have been talking about trying to start a new movement in Nebraska, which we would call Nebraskans for Climate Action. So not only trying to bring together various environmental groups, but trying to bring together Nebraskans of every walk of life across the state. Because the polling in the state shows that 65 to 70% of Nebraskans are concerned about climate change. And so the fact that the government, our state government, for the last 5 years has not even seriously considered a bill to establish a climate action plan is just horrendous in my view. And then we have to ask ourselves, what's our legacy for our children and our grandchildren? And so we all have a part in moving from inaction to action to hope. I think this is my last slide. I thought I would throw this in here because I think it makes an important point. But first of all, people ask the question, well, which sectors are contributing the most to this increase in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. Where are these emissions coming from? Well, these emissions are coming from obviously agriculture, commercial and residential, and this is just for the United States, transportation, industry, electricity. The point here is that if we're going to find a solution to this problem, if we're going to mitigate climate change moving forward, in addition to trying to adapt to the changes that we're already seeing, all sectors are contributing to the problem. And this is true on a global scale as well. So all sectors have to be part of the solution. And so for some sectors to sort of pull away, and I'll use it as an example, agriculture. Agriculture a couple of decades ago, when conversations started about climate change and how we can address this issue going forward, agriculture kind of pulled away from the table. They are now back at the table, fortunately, but we cannot afford for any of these sectors to pull away from the table. We all have to be there looking for solutions to this problem moving forward. So with that, I'm going to close. Again, I'm illustrating these two reports that we talked about, and I really encourage you to take a look at these. This first report goes into the science of climate change, but it does it in a very non-technical way. So the report was issued for public consumption, not for the science community. So it really talks about the science of climate change, both natural as well as human forcing functions here, as well as the projections going forward. And again, both of these are available at the site that I mentioned below. So Lori, with that, I will turn it back to you and stop sharing my screen. So thanks everyone for your attention.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Don. A couple of questions in the chat, and I've always got questions, Don. So if anybody else has questions and you want to add those to the chat, that would be great. First, just a quick clarification, Don. What does accelerate greenhouse gas emissions mean?
Accelerating greenhouse gas emissions. Well, what we're talking about is principally here the burning of fossil fuels, and the fact that the burning of fossil fuels is escalating at such a rapid rate worldwide. So while in some areas we've been trying to stabilize the burning of fossil fuels by moving to renewable energies, the developing world, and which includes many, many countries, are still very, very reliant upon coal as a fossil fuel. And so what we're seeing is an increasing rate of greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon dioxide. So one of the interesting things, just to follow on that, is with the pandemic, you probably all heard that carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere actually decreased a bit for the first part of 2020. But once again, as things started to return to normal, and I don't know, we're certainly not back to normal, but as things started to open up, transportation returning and so on, industries gearing back up, this slight decline in CO2 emissions in the early to middle part of 2020 rapidly went back on its former trajectory.
A question, Don, in the chat about basically a carbon fee and dividend program. Do you care to express an opinion on that? And maybe, and just the idea basically is to charge a fee or a tax on carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think this makes a lot of sense. And certainly, groups like the Citizens Climate Lobby and other groups have really been pushing the idea of a carbon tax. And so those people that are burning the most fossil fuels are going to be taxed the most. and other people, that this tax would then come back to people and actually represent sort of a dividend or payment back to say the average citizen and so on. I mean, this makes a lot of sense, but I think it's one of a number of sort of a suite of actions that we need to be looking at. So the carbon tax idea is supported by some, debated by many, and so on. And certainly you're seeing that even within the US Congress.
So, Don, a question about, I think this really reflects the fact that, at least my understanding is, energy demand around the world continues to grow as countries develop. And so even though renewable energy is increasing, we're not seeing a decrease in fossil fuel usage enough that is proportionately anyway to decrease carbon dioxide emissions. So basically, can we ever get ahead of this?
Well, I think we can, but it's going to require rapidly developing technology and deployment of technology and innovation. One of the keys here is that the countries that have a lot of the technology to move us to renewable energy, and these developing countries that are building more in the way of coal-fired facilities and so on, we need to be exporting that technology to these countries so that they don't go down the same path that we've gone down. So it's important that we try to get ahead of this. And of course, that's what the climate conference in Glasgow is all about, is countries pledging to make reductions in their greenhouse gas emissions moving forward. And that's going to require a shift to more renewables. And they're going to be dependent upon the technology being exported from the developed countries of the world and the rapid deployment of that technology over the next few years moving forward. So that's the only way we can really get ahead of this. And of course, improving energy efficiency and things like that are part of the equation as well that I mentioned previously.
So, Don, I know you've got your finger on the pulse of what's happening in Nebraska policy-wise, in addition to the science. So, are you aware of what we can expect in the legislature this year in terms of introduction of a bill to have to at least study having a climate action plan for Nebraska? We haven't even been able to get that so far, but any inside track on what's coming?
Well, yeah, there have been a number of conversations that we've had about that. Most everyone agrees that given the makeup of the current legislature and also the person who sits in our governor's office, there's very little likelihood that a bill is going to pass the legislature this year that is going to try and move us or move the needle on the development of a climate action plan, even though the majority of Nebraskans feel that this is of some urgency and we need to do that. And I think the two reports that I mentioned previously that we did in 2014 and 2015, these two reports actually provide a lot of the foundational basis for building a climate action plan. So it's not as though we're starting from scratch. There is a lot of information that's there. There has been a climate action plan bill introduced in the legislature each of the 5 recent sessions, and only once did it get to the floor. And when it got to the floor, the Republican senators filibustered it. So there was really not a discussion. Now, there was a bill last year that never made it out of committee that was introduced by Senator Kavanaugh. And that bill is still alive. It's the second year of the biennium. So that bill is still alive. But whether he or some other senator will make this a priority bill so that it might actually move forward is, at this point, I think, anybody's guess.
So, Don, I see we're almost out of time. So if you could wave a magic wand and have the one thing that you'd really like to see happen to address climate change, what would it be?
Well, it needs to be, I mean, a lot of things are happening at the local level, and a lot of things are happening at state levels in some states around the country. But one thing that would really drive this is right now, we have this debate going on in our national politics as to whether we should deal with climate change or just continue to ignore it. And so I would like to see much more progressive action at the national scale. And obviously that has to carry over to the global scale as well. So that's one of the things. I mean, the business community is moving along. Corporations understand that it is in their best interest if they don't plan for the future based upon a changing climate, it's going to affect their bottom line. And so they have a moral obligation as well as a obligation to stakeholders to take climate change into account. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and you could go through and talk about all the automotive companies and a lot of other groups that are really trying to get on board with this and are doing good things. I think government has to set an example and has to put forward a plan and a strategy so that other people can get on board and sort of remove a lot of the politics associated with this and do what's best for our country and what's best for Americans and what's best for the world. And I'll add one more thing to that because this is near and dear to me. And that is, what is the University of Nebraska doing to not only educate its students about climate change and how it's going to affect their future, their career path, their earning potential, their environment, their children, and their children's future. And at the moment, the university has identified 7 grand challenges, one of which is climate resilience. I'm hopeful that the university is going to take that seriously and actually do a reorganization of the university so that all disciplines can come together to work on this problem, not only educating Nebraskans and Nebraska students, but also educating the business community and local governments and so on about the importance of dealing with this issue. With that, I will shut up.
That was great. Thank you very much, Don. We really appreciate Don being with us this evening, and as usual, is an excellent presentation. I will take just yeah, there we go. Just mention a couple of things. Following on with Don's conversation about the legislature and the fact that climate change is addressed at various levels. If you're not sure how to get involved in the policy arena with climate change, whether you're talking city, county, state, federal level, we had a session about a year ago, a panel that Ken Haar and some others were on, that was a primer on how to be an advocate on climate change at these various levels of government. How do you approach it? What do you say? And so forth. And if you'd like to see that, it's just as relevant today as it was a year ago. You'll find that on the Climate Action Team webpage, where you got the link for our presentation tonight under videos and resources. And it's called something like Effective Advocacy Basics, something like that. So I'll recommend that to you if you'd like to get involved but aren't sure what to say. And even though it may seem like a lost cause, our senators need to hear from us. So, and then I'll mention that there we've recorded the talk this evening, and it should be on the Climate Action Team's webpage in the next day or two. You will also find Dr. Hayhoe's presentation from last week, which is excellent, is also, the link is already on that webpage. So I'll recommend that to you. If you'd like to continue the conversation about climate change and communication and how to have those effective conversations, please join Reverend Penny Greer for a 3-week class centered on Dr. Hayhoe's book. The class begins this Sunday, November 7th. It's by Zoom, and details are on the First-Plymouth website. And finally, I want to mention coming up next year, an initiative by and for faith communities in Lincoln. So far, we have 24 communities that are coming together to celebrate trees, and that obviously is a climate change issue. During 2022, we'll have stewardship and community activities, tree Sabbaths, a call to plant trees, book discussions, policy advocacy, volunteer opportunities, and discussion of why care of trees is a spiritual and environmental justice issue. You can learn more about Faith to Forest starting on the Climate Action Team webpage. I do want to emphasize that while First-Plymouth is hosting the webpage for Faith to Forest, for this initiative, this is a community activity with, as I said, 24 faith communities signed on so far, and hopefully more to come. Everybody is welcome. So with that, we will close. Thank you again, Don. We can see some hands up for Don. Thank you so much. And
Thank you. Again, Nora.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Yeah, bye-bye.